Rod Stewart had performed for 50,000 people that night. He walked off stage, turned to his tour manager, and said 4 words. "Get me into her dressing room." It was the summer of 1978. Rod Stewart was 33 years old and already one of the biggest rock stars on the planet. Faces, the Jeff Beck Group, Atlantic Crossing, Footloose and Fancy Free. He had sold out stadiums on 3 continents, and his name had been on the cover of every magazine that mattered. He knew how to command a stage. He had been doing it since he was 22. But that summer, at a 2-night festival in Los Angeles, where his set closed the main stage, Rod Stewart had done something he almost never did. He had arrived early. He had stood in the wings for 45 minutes, watching the act that went on before him. By the time that act was finished, Rod Stewart had gone very quiet. His band noticed it. His tour manager noticed it. The kind of quiet that comes over a person when they have just heard something that reorders everything they thought they understood. Then he turned around, and he said the 4 words. The act that went on before Rod Stewart that night was Etta James. She had been performing for 23 years by then. She had survived chess records and the lean years and the personal damage that the music industry does to people it cannot fully contain. She had come through all of it and arrived at a version of herself that was, by 1978, more powerful than anything that had come before it. The set list that night was not designed to impress critics or chase radio play. It was designed by a woman who had spent 2 decades learning exactly what a human voice can do to a room full of people who are already carrying something heavy. She opened with something slow. She let the band settle before she sang the first note. And when she did sing, when she really opened, the entire festival grounds went still in the way that 50,000 people almost never go still. The noise stopped. Not because anyone told it to, because something was happening on that stage that made noise feel wrong. Rod Stewart was standing in the left wing, about 20 meters back, with his arms crossed. His tour manager would say later that he didn't move for 30 minutes. He just stood there and listened. Rod Stewart had heard Etta James before, of course. He had heard the records. He had heard At Last on the radio when he was still a teenager in London, trying to figure out what kind of singer he wanted to be. But hearing a record and standing 20 meters from the source of it are 2 entirely different things. What happened in Rod Stewart in those 45 minutes in the left wing is difficult to describe precisely. He would try to describe it himself years later in a radio interview that most people never heard. He said it was like watching someone do something you had always believed you could do and realizing for the first time that you had been doing a version of it, that you had been standing next to the real thing your entire career without ever being in the same room as it. When Etta James finished her last song and walked off the opposite side of the stage, the applause came back like a wave. Rod Stewart did not move. His bassist touched his arm and said they were on in 12 minutes. Rod Stewart turned around slowly. He looked at his tour manager. He said 4 words. "Get me into her dressing room." His tour manager's name was Dennis. Dennis had been working with Rod Stewart for 6 years and had navigated every kind of backstage situation that existed in the rock world of the 1970s. He had never been asked to arrange a meeting in the 12 minutes before a headline set. He went anyway. He found the door. He knocked. He explained who was asking. The answer that came back was, "Tell him he has 5 minutes." Rod Stewart had already performed his full set by the time the meeting actually happened. He went on, did the show, did it well. 50,000 people, an hour and 40 minutes, the full production. His voice was what his voice always was, rough and alive and technically imperfect in all the ways that made it his. And the entire time he was performing, he was thinking about those 45 minutes in the wing, about the stillness, about what it meant that he had spent 20 years building a career on the strength of his voice and had just watched someone make him feel like a student. After the show, sweating, still in his stage clothes, Rod Stewart knocked on Etta James's dressing room door himself. This time there was no intermediary. What happened in that dressing room in the 40 minutes that followed has never been fully reported. No journalist present, no recording, no publicist in the corner taking notes. What exists is Rod Stewart's own account, given once in a late-night radio interview in 2003 to a host who asked him about the singers who had changed him. He answered without hesitation. He said, "There was one night with Etta James that I have never stopped thinking about." He opened the door. Etta James was sitting at the makeup table in a robe, her face already cleaned of the stage, a glass of water in her hand. She looked at him in the mirror without turning around. He had prepared something to say, a specific compliment about the third song in the set, about the way she had held a particular note for just a beat longer than anyone expected and what that had done to the crowd. He had rehearsed it walking down the corridor. But when he was actually standing in the room with Etta James looking at him in the mirror, the prepared sentence went somewhere he couldn't reach. What came out instead were the true words. He said, "I don't know how you do that." Etta James set down her water glass. She turned around on the stool and looked at him directly for the first time. She said, "Do what?" Rod Stewart sat down in the only other chair in the room without being invited to, and he told her. He told her about the stillness, about the 50,000 people who went quiet, about what it had felt like to stand in the wing and watch someone do in 45 minutes what he had been trying to do for 20 years. He said, "You made them stop. Not just listen. Stop. I've been playing stadiums for a decade, and I have never once made 50,000 people actually stop." Etta James listened to all of this without expression. Not cold, just still. The same quality of stillness she carried on stage applied now to the room. And then she said something that Rod Stewart would repeat in various forms for the rest of his life. She said, "The stopping isn't something you do to them. The stopping is what happens when you finally stop performing for them and start telling the truth to them instead." Rod Stewart looked at her. He said, "How long did it take you to learn that?" Etta James was quiet for a moment. She picked up her water glass. She looked at the wall. She said, 23 years, and I'm still learning it." What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 40 minutes, in a dressing room after midnight, with a bottle of water and two people who had built their entire lives on standing in front of crowds and making them feel something. Rod Stewart asked questions he had never asked anyone before, not about technique, not about range or breath control or the mechanics of what a voice can do, about truth, about how you know when you're telling it and when you're hiding from it, about the difference between performing a song and living inside it. Etta James answered every question, not with advice. She never told him what to do. She told him what she had learned, at the cost of things she couldn't replace. At one point she said, "The audience always knows before you do. You can feel the room change when you cross the line from show to real." Most singers spend their whole career on the wrong side of that line and never find out why. Rod Stewart left Etta James's dressing room at close to 1 in the morning. His band had long since gone back to the hotel. Dennis was asleep in a chair outside the door. He walked to the car without speaking, quiet on the drive back, quiet at the hotel, quiet at breakfast the next morning when his guitarist asked how the show had gone. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes a good story when you tell it later. In the quiet, internal way that real shifts happen. The kind that only become visible months afterward when you look back and try to locate the moment things changed. His next album was recorded differently. The people in the studio noticed it immediately. He was less interested in what sounded good and more interested in what sounded true. He pushed takes further. He let silences land. He stopped fixing things that felt right but sounded imperfect. He never credited Etta James publicly for any of this, not then. It took him 25 years and a radio interview in 2003 to say out loud what had happened in that dressing room after midnight. He said, "She told me the thing I had needed to hear since I was 22 years old." The radio interview was not a major one. It aired on a small program late on a Thursday night to an audience that was a fraction of Rod Stewart's usual reach. Most people who heard it have forgotten everything about it except the 12 minutes he spent talking about Etta James. He said, "I had been performing for a very long time when I met her. I thought I understood what the job was. I was wrong." He described the stillness from the wing. He described the dressing room, the water glass, the question he had asked. And then he said the words she had given him. The stopping isn't something you do to them. It's what happens when you start telling the truth instead of performing it. The host asked, "Did you tell her what that meant to you?" Rod Stewart paused. He said, "I tried. I don't think I had the right words for it at the time." She already knew, I think. She was that kind of person. She knew what she gave people, whether they said it back or not. He said, "I have never since walked onto a stage without thinking about what she said in that room. Not once in 25 years. Etta James never spoke publicly about the night Rod Stewart knocked on her door. She was not the kind of person who collected the testimony of other artists as evidence of her own importance. She didn't need to. What she said to him that night, the distinction between performing for people and telling the truth to them, was not something she had developed for a dressing room conversation with a rock star. It was something she had earned across 23 years of standing in front of crowds that could always tell the difference. Crowds always can. The question is whether the person on the stage is willing to let them close enough to feel it. Rod Stewart spent the rest of his career trying to cross that line. He built the second half of his work, in part, around exactly the kind of material: standards, ballads, songs that require exposure, that forces a singer to tell the truth or fail in front of everyone. He credited her once, in a small radio interview late on a Thursday night to an audience of maybe 10,000 people. It was enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and leave a comment. Which part of this conversation would you have wanted to hear in full? Because there are more stories where this one came from, and they deserve to be heard.